I'm driving the beginning of the end. The 190, the car that made new Mercedes-Benz ownership possible for the masses, the wider market. So I can sit here ensconced in the quality of Stuttgart's fullest sincerity, without laying down the capital equivalent to the value of a small to medium house. The insult of driving about in a bone wind-up windows stock W123 is translated into sensible modesty in this W201, although it was really only the price that was adjusted rather than any equipment levels. Think of it as a Mercedes-Benz Neue Klasse, and it did for Stuttgart just what the 1600s, 2000s, 2002 and later 3 Series did for Munich. That's some historical context for you. But before I start hammering this car, or rather what the market response of this car did to Mercedes-Benz, like an author unleashing his resentment in the preface, let's just analyse this car in isolation. Does it waft? Of course it wafts. It's Mercedes-Benz, and even in Sportline trim. There's an underlying sense of integrity with the way this car challenges the road surface. Even this humble, let's say well-used example, it's still there. The inherent sophistication just about speaks over 3 decades of wear. Perhaps the finest and most convincing part of the 190e driving experience is the internal surroundings. Its cabin is fully trimmed in leather, cloth, that lovely checkered pattern on the seats is timeless. Wood, high quality plastic. In fact, all of it is high quality. And that permeates the cabin about as strongly as that can't quite put my finger on it old Mercedes-Benz smell. If you're a fan and lust over Mark II Golfs for their vintage but modern interior feel, you'll be all over this. Actually, that's not fair. This car is much nicer than some mere Volkswagen. Note the very modern dashboard design, neatly integrated instrument binnacle, centre stack, glove box, transmission tunnel, all one piece. Checked fabric lines the doors, covers the seats, and the usefully wide armrest. Sportline touches are littered about, not least the wheel. Thankfully not one of those awful 80s throwback to throw up Liberace things. And those subtly suggestive details tie in with a driving experience of similarly restrained flair. There is a pointed competency though, in that rear suspension, 5-link, multi-link, new from Mercedes-Benz. They had been toying with swing axles, trailing arms and panhard rods and things like that. And not only did it fill out exciting phrases in brochures, but it also supported somewhat short-lived rallying ambitions that really led to this rivalry with the BMW M3 at the time. Both were quite advanced sports saloons, and that suspension and the whole design of the chassis allowed it to compete on a very much higher level than Mercedes was used to. But while the Cosworth stood in the limelight, it's worth remembering that the Sportline got a few choice drivers options of its own, borrowed from that car. Stiffer springs, lower by 20mm, and firmer shocks to match, plus anti-roll bars and revised ball joints. It was really a comprehensive reworking of the front end. Wheels and tyres too. Special Sportline alloys, not those ultimately classy Mercedes-Benz steels with those circular wheel trims, because that wouldn't be quite sporty enough, would it? Well, the joy of bending sidewalls and pinging off hubcaps like a car chase from Hill Street Blues notwithstanding, the car flows down the road rather nicely and retains far more composure than you might expect from some old Mercedes-Benz. There's that suspension, of course, plus with anti-dive geometry at the front that towards and up to the limit keeps everything calm and controlled. Throttle, especially considering modern standards, is sufficiently crisp and manageable. Pair that with a closer steering ratio and a smaller steering wheel, 390mm. That's the smallest they did. I think they did 5 during the course of the 190, right from the big captain's wheel to this, where they carried this size over to the W202. Put all that together and yes, you can have real fun driving this car. We don't tend to use sat-nav here on Espuela Grande, but fortunately the 190 has a usefully flat bonnet. Occasionally you want to stop and have a look at the car anyway. It's a really good looking car, this. A mini S-Class they would have you think, and it kind of is. That tall chrome bonnet, over square headlights, bumpers perfect for William Willard posing, and distinct panel creases that firmly state its conservative, superior being. One of my favourite angles though is this. Rear tail light with like a heat sink type structure, unapologetically flat boot lid, and a C-pillar with as much authority as a Roman column. It drives how it looks really, although you do sit surprisingly low. Visibility, driving position and the seat itself are good. And there's adequately sharp steering, although not bristling with feel. At least it doesn't have the double wishbone bump thump of its C-Class successor, a bonus here in bumpy UK B-road territory. A surprisingly little body roll too, even considering this is the Sportline, and so even with a relatively meagre 2-litre 122 horsepower, it could be hustled along rather splendidly. And so long as you treat it as a Mercedes-Benz, not some hyped up Japanese Revomatic, it sounds good too. There's a smooth turbine-like hum to the way it travels its rev range that tickles the inner aristocrat. Although it does lose its cool at the top end and casts away all decorum. And that's exactly what happened in the end. We got those sport versions of the C-Class, actually AMG style ones, and that Mercedes composure was thrown out the window. Apparently people want their German sedans to drive like brittle hot hatches. I suppose this is something like a C220 AMG of today, except that they only really stiffen the suspension and put giant wheels on those, not the more considered approach of this car. Anyway, there were obviously more powerful engines. 2.3 8-valve, thought of as a warm Cosworth, 150 horsepower. There was a lovely 2.6 6-cylinder. Remember, this car only weighs about 1,200 kilos. Diesels too, 4 and 5 cylinders, and the latter was available with enough turbo boost to warrant a Sportline badge. Yeah, there's no doubt this is a Mercedes-Benz. If you've seen those old videos of slamming boot lids and doors, an automotive, more punishing version of IKEA's demonstration boxes, that's what this car's about. The foundations of this car serve to underlie the purpose with which that emblem cuts the horizon.
Here we are at Clacton, one of the great British seaside locations, made popular of course by this expanding travel that was suddenly possible. Well, with that travel there was the Great British Exodus. International holidays become suddenly much more possible, and in that same sense the embrace of marketing hollowed out the foundations of what Mercedes once were and left just mere echoes of what once was. It really is one of those last of the proper cars, or just a rose-tinted sunset.
It's an inevitability to have to compare this car to the BMW E30 3 Series, and while, yes, that's a car that might have been more of a hoot to drive on some of these roads today, I think that's missing the point of the 190e. It's a Mercedes-Benz in the truest sense. There's depth of ability here, integrity, a range of qualities, and driving it is more than just a linear experience. If you approach it as something to take in and appreciate over time, then its charm really begins to take. And as the light fades, those classic Mercedes dials illuminate with a warming glow, the rest of the interior cast in darkening shadows. Other cars' headlights become less distinguishable. This car's depth of character shines distinct.
It was the great British seaside, and it was Die beste Auto, and now it's faded to grey.